The hockey world's buzzing with the Four Nations face-off, but astute fantasy hockey GMs, they're digging in the trenches, baby, looking at some angles to get to the top over the next couple of weeks, which is why the Friday episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, taking a look ahead at this NHL trade deadline and some top pieces that could improve their fantasy value and down the stretch. Let's get this paper.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hockey heads, degenerate gamblers, unite, stand up. It's your show. We're back in the lab for the Friday edition of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, your 30-minute source for NHL news, fantasy breakdowns, and, of course, all of the betting picks that you need to stack this paper. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at You Know What It Is. It's coming up on my screen right now, Steele, and I'm really cheesed, but it's going to be brought to you by somebody in a hot second. It's actually not brought to you by anybody, so giddy up and here we go. Obviously, been watching a little bit too much of Four Nations Face-Off and now focusing on these ad reads, Steele. But as much as the hockey world's buzzing, we're going to get to the Four Nations once again, every single team in action Saturday night, and what went down in that first Team Canada game and Team USA's tilt against Finland. We're taking a look at the trade deadline, trade bait board, players that could be on the move, Steele, players that I think you and I both still see fantasy value in. Has it been a tough start, a tough go for some of them? Sure. But I think some of these names that are likely to move cities could still hold a ton of value, and that is the angle that you want to cover as a hockey GM. So over to you. Who are you looking at here? Because I think some of these players, if you pick the right one in the right situation, Steele, I think there is some fantasy boom to be had, and these guys are probably out there in your league. So let's talk about them.
Yeah, most definitely. And there's a lot of traction right now around Brayden Schenn of the St. Louis Blues. A lot of Stanley Cup contenders looking for center depth, especially from a veteran of Brayden Schenn's caliber. And, obviously has regressed a little bit. The St. Louis Blues have not been one of the best teams over the last few years, but he brings a lot of variety to his game and a lot of aspects to his game, which I think he can fit in real nicely in any team, Stanley Cup contending team that were to target him. And there's a lot of vultures out there right now targeting the Blues with Schenn. Vegas Golden Knights and the Edmonton Oilers are circling right now to see if they could potentially get something done. But 32 points in 56 games. Again, he's got different elements to his game. He's not just he doesn't just bring the boom with the hits. 142 hits this season. He does score goals. He does play make. Has faltered a little bit, like I said, with the offensive group that the Blues have this year. It might be tough for a couple of Stanley Cup contending teams to actually go after this guy. He's 33 years old, soon to be 34 in the summer. He still has 3 years left on his contract after this season is over at $6.5 million. So if any deal were to be had, the Blues are most likely going to be retaining at least a portion of his salary just to get some of that off the books for the contenders out there. But Brayden Schenn, I still think, has a lot of value fantasy-wise, especially in banger leagues. Like I said, he has 12 straight seasons, 10 straight seasons. 12 straight season, yes, of 120-plus hits. I mean, he likes to throw his weight around. He takes a lot of penalty minutes. He scores goals. He gets assists. Obviously not as much as he once has done, but I still think there's a lot of value with this player, especially if he does get traded to a contending team.
He's been a week-to-week darling. 1 week, he does nothing. The next week, he pops a few goals. He pops a few noses, and he's valuable, Steele. He's also, what makes me attractive to this situation is he's going to go to a winner. Somebody is going to have to pay that 6.5 price tag. Yeah, you made a great point with the retention. That's going to be an angle. But this isn't a team I don't think is going to be on the bubble situation that goes after Brayden Schenn. I'm looking at one of those top teams to really take their forward group into that area of being bona fide winners, because let's be honest, he is that. He's won a Stanley Cup and been a big piece of the success of the St. Louis Blues. I know it's not been pretty the last couple of years, but this guy has been a clutch performer. I just had his playoff numbers up as well, Steele, in the postseason, in 75 career postseason games, 40 points, so he gets it done there. So far this season, you wouldn't have really been looking at him aside from a banger league fill-in. If
Yeah.
he goes to a winner and you still have a hole in that forward group, I'm going to take a nice long look at Brayden Schenn because he is that type of guy. If he gets reinvigorated to a team that's actually in it, I could see his value going up because he is a gamer and he's going to bring it. Let me talk about a player here in Seth Jones that's on this board. We're looking at the TSN trade bait board. Brayden Schenn slides in at 10. They have Seth Jones at 7. Seth Jones has 24 points in 36 games played this year. That's actually pretty good for Seth Jones on the Chicago Blackhawks. And I understand that he is being paid a very serious amount of money at
Egregious.
$9.5 million, which is actually mind-boggling and really hard to put together. When this guy was coming up, though, Steele, he was looking to be one of those fantasy darlings that anchors your team. And I know those days are gone. But I think at 30 years old, after toiling now with Columbus and Chicago through tough years, if someone does take a shot on him, someone even on the bubble, I think this is a situation where I'm going to look at long and hard about grabbing him for some value. Is it risky? Oh, yeah, it is. But if he goes to a good situation, this guy has done nothing but eat minutes his whole career, right there at 25, 26 minutes of ice time per night. I think there's some value here if he goes to a better team. It's a pit in Chicago. His plus minus over the last number of years is up in the negative 150 something. So this value ties to me to where he goes, but I wanted to come on here and just flag it for some GMs out there. His offensive numbers have been pretty good this season. And if he goes to a team in the hunt with a better group around him, I think Seth Jones at 30 years old, this could be the sneakiest one on the board, Steele, at least on the blue line.
He was supposed to be the next guy up, the next star-studded defenseman in the league, former fourth overall pick back in his draft year. And, like you said, he's just gone through some really tough years. Started his season, his tenure in the league in Nashville, then with Columbus, then with Chicago, and has just battled through injuries along the way.
Yes.
The fact that he was making $9.5 million or is making $9.5 million, even when that deal came out, I think everyone's jaw hit the floor because we were absolutely we couldn't wrap our heads around that deal.
Speechless.
And it's speechless. And it has not worked out, but he has put up some good numbers this year in the limited amount of games. Once again, injured this season, 26 points in 38 games. But like you said, he eats a lot of minutes. I think a lot of teams out there always look for right shot defensemen around the deadline, heading into the postseason as well. There's a few out there, Seth Jones being one of them, Rasmus Ristolainen being another one. Not a lot of great options out there at the ahead of the deadline this season.
Thank you for pointing
that out. There's only a few names really that kind of poke their heads out, that stick out more than the others. A couple of outliers, but Seth Jones is one of them because of what he's done in the limited amount of time he's done this season.
Taking his stat line before we get to break, before we get to the rest of these trade bait board pieces that I think have some value that you guys need to pay attention to. Like I said, these are high-risk situations for a lot of these players, but with everybody paying attention to Four Nations right now, you might be able to hit that waiver wire, especially if these trades start to heat up after this break. Taking his stat line, though, from the second last game that the Blackhawks had, Steele, a goal, an assist, a power play goal, 3 shots on net, 2 hits, and 4 block shots in 22 minutes of ice time per night. If he's doing that with the Chicago Blackhawks right now, even sporadically every couple of games, and he goes to a good team, there's fantasy value to be had. There's some to be had. With the other players on this list that we'll get to, we'll be here for a Saturday special. Back to the Four Nations, bets, fantasy impact, all 4 teams in action. You're going to be making some of those bets with our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, NBA action getting started, there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, place live bets throughout the game so you never miss anything from the opening tip or to that fourth quarter comeback. Stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, combine them together into our favorite here on this pod, the same game parlay. You know how we feel about the same game parlays, always throwing them out. We might have one for tomorrow night, so tap in. Right now, FanDuel customers that bet $150 in their first bet and win, they get $150 with bonus bets. FanDuel.com to join today. FanDuel.com to shoot your shot at that $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
And thank you so much for tuning in for today's Friday episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Thank you so much for all that love and support. Hit the subscribe button, hit the follow button, leave a 5-star review, Flip, and I appreciate it. Make sure you share with your friends and family out there. Get us to 2,000 subscribers. It really does mean the world to us. That's why we do what we do. And that's why we're talking about the trade bait board in the National Hockey League this season going into March. There's a few names out there. That's why we're bringing them up right now. And number 2 on the board is Ricard Rakell of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And I think we have to talk about him on Team Sweden, Four Nations face-off. A good game to start off this tournament as well between Canada and Sweden, going into overtime, getting 10 minutes of overtime as well, back and forth action. Ricard Rakell is on the team for a reason, and he's on the board. He's on the trade board, bait board for a reason as well. We know that Kyle Dubas has opened this franchise as a fire sale right there coming into this trade deadline. Besides Sidney Crosby, everyone is available. And the most valuable player of all right now, most likely, is Rickard Rakell. You know, there's Erik Karlsson, but the contract is too high. Chris Letang, can he keep up? Prone injuries as well. Evgeny Malkin injured. So for me, Rickard Rakell holds the most value for Kyle Dubas going into the deadline. And I think he holds the most value fantasy-wise as well. He's number 2 on the board. He's having a fantastic season. He's been great bounce back year. Great season. He's been great since he's entered the team just 3 seasons ago, but 48 points in 56 games playing alongside Sidney Crosby, 93 hits, 66 blocks, and 146 shots on net. This is a player that is not very available out in all formats or in sports leagues. Owned at 74% on Yahoo right now. I believe he's around the same number on ESPN and other sports platforms too. Yeah, this is kind of a guy right now who could be a sell high target, or sell high for those who own him right now, because you could get a lot of return if he does actually get traded before the deadline, which, knowing Kyle Dubas, he most likely do. Ricard Rakell, he's locked in for another 4 years as well, only at $5 million. So there's definitely going to be a lot of teams buzzing around him, trying to get him in that top 6 forward group of whatever organization acquires him.
Yeah, I'm seeing 3 years left on his deal, but
3 years. 3 years after this year.
And what's interesting is I think I read somewhere most recently that Dubas is actually trying to play hardball with Rakell in terms of the value he thinks he wants back, which I find really funny. I don't think hardball and Kyle Dubas has ever been something that's worked out. So that's interesting. His value over the last couple of years has been hard to manage because he does actually bring those peripherals pretty solid in terms of he likes to throw the body around. But when he went so long last season, prolonged stretch without points, I don't think anyone was looking at Ricard Rakell this year. And I like to say this, Steele, I look up at a lot of leagues that we've been in otherwise. The Ricard Rakells of the world, a bonus 48 points in 56 games. This was maybe the guy you took as your last pick, or because he had a decent start, you picked him up early on the waiver wire and you've held him. That's one of those situations for Ricard Rakell owners this year, I truly do feel. And if he moves, this is one of those situations that, because he's played well, you want to think it's going to mean good things, but he's also played with Sid. So you know how I feel about that angle. However, given what he brings peripherally, given that, these players are on the trade bait board because either a serious contender or a team making to look a serious push in the face are going to make. So that's an angle that GMs have to cover. So thank you for bringing up Ricard Rakell. I totally agree with you about the value of players on this board. It ain't pretty, but some of it is there. Let me talk about it in John Gibson. Over the last 5 games, Steele, John Gibson has a .944 save percentage, losing close games to the Florida Panthers, beating the Nashville Predators and Dallas Stars. There's value here in John Gibson. I'll say this too. I just got done explaining about teams adding. If John Gibson goes in there down the stretch, he's a beautiful security blanket for your fantasy hockey team because he's likely going to a good squad and he's playing well. You know he's motivated as well, Steele. I wanted to highlight a D-man, a forward, and a goalie. So the goalie is John Gibson. What is he here on the trade bait board just for fun?
Believe he's top 10.
He's ninth. So 2 years left at 6.4 mil. Obviously hurts, but he's been pretty good this year since returning from injury. He's got a .915 save percentage and a .269 goals against average to go along with a record of 9-9-2. So that's actually really good considering how bad the Ducks are. That makes me intrigued even more so. All of these situations are worth monitoring fantasy-wise because there will be value there. I like John Gibson, 31 years old. There's still some left in the tank there. A good goalie who also has proven that he can make that big-time save for you. I like John Gibson. Keep an eye on him.
All I can say is I'll believe it when I see it. He's been on the trade bait board every single season. So I swear for the last 5 years. I'll believe it when it actually comes through on my phone. I'm not going to believe anyone's word. I got to see it visually for myself. Great point, though. He's having his best season. Again, in limited games, only 23 games on the season. But like you said, 9-9-2 record with a .915 save percentage, his best in the last 5 seasons. And again, Lucas Dostal, a big reason for that, taking over, obviously when he was injured, but also just being the young guy in there now. It's about time. I mean, the Anaheim Ducks have been, wiggling and waving John Gibson in the faces of other franchises for years. And again, I'll believe it when I see it, but it is a great thing to have John Gibson as that security blanket for any team out there, any fantasy team as well. Rostered at 15% on Yahoo. He is most likely available across formats right now. When we come back after the break, we're going to continue talking about some of the top trade bait board players, especially going into the playoffs for your fantasy hockey teams. If they were to be traded, make sure you're staying tuned in for Saturday's special episode where Flip and I are going to break down the 4 nations face off. You've got Sweden taking on Finland, USA and Team Canada Saturday night, 8 p.m. Juicy game. Sidney Crosby, what a performance in game 1, 3 assist night, and the MVP in game 1. All of that and more coming up next. And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Pod your first listen every single day. Continue to smash that subscribe button, the follow button, leave a 5-star review. Flip and I appreciate all that love and support you show us. Flip, I'm going to throw it back over to you, my friend. Last player on the board who you see that has a ton of value if they were to be traded before the deadline in March.
So at first I wanted to talk about Gustav Nyquist because of what he was been able to do, especially last season, the 75 points in 81 games really jumped off the page. And I could see him being that prototypical 35-year-old veteran hired gun that just gets slotted into a team's top 6 and lights it up down the stretch. So I wanted to throw some love there, but I think actually more value and youth lies in 2 players that at 11 and 12, I think the ranking of this board is somewhat sus, in my opinion, Steele. I would have Jake Evans much higher. I think Jake Evans he's
been very sneaky this year.
Season under the radar. And look, 27 points in 54 games isn't exactly jumping off the page. He's 28. He makes $1.7 million down the stretch and is a UFA. If he plays well, you keep him for cheap. So you don't have to pay $9.5 million. Excuse me.
All good.
Okay.
Brother.
For Seth Jones, you can do Jake Evans for cheaps. I like Ryan Donato as well in the same kind of boat, same kind of aspect. Ryan Donato, good season, 32 points in 51 games. So I like both of those players. I think Jake Evans is the one I like the most. I don't know if Montreal's going to let him go. And because of those flashes of brilliance this season, they might be asking for a high price. But if either of those guys move and get to play with a bit of a higher caliber of player, and I know Donato's had some time with Bedard this season, same vein as all the other players we've talked about. I like Evans the most, though. I think he could really be a player that on a winner can surge down the stretch for you, and he would become an immediate must-add for me if he does go to a team competing.
Yeah, sneaky good season for Jake Evans of Montreal Canadiens. He's 28 years old. He's got 27 points in 55 games. Never been known for the offensive production, but he's made himself. He's put himself in the spotlight a few times this year in Montreal, and what he's been able to do in that top 9 group. I'm also on the same edge with a young player here, and we've talked about him so many times this year, but I had to bring him once again. He's closer to the bottom of the trade board here. Dylan Cozens of the Buffalo Sabres. I just think there's so much value to be had. There's so many teams. I think every single team wants Dylan Cozens in a trade before March, but before March's deadline. And we know that he has regressed over the last couple of seasons. But what Stanley Cup contending team, anyways, wouldn't want to sign, wouldn't want to trade for a 23-year-old who's already locked in for the next 6 seasons at $7.1 million, who has so much potential, who's shown that he can be a 65 plus point player, who's shown that he has so much elements to his game, and he's 23 years old. There's so much more to develop. There's so much more to learn in that right organization. Over the last couple of years, it hasn't worked that way in his favor and the Sabres organization's favor, but he likes to, he throws his weight around. 121 hits this season, which is a career high. 36 blocks, career high. 121 shots, a pretty decent regression in that category where he's been over 200 plus the last 2 seasons. But going from 68 points, 47 points to now 27 and 54, he's on pace for just over 40. Do teams want to take that chance on a young player who is locked up but has shown regression over the last couple of years? It's a big risk for sure, but I think all teams out there see the potential in Dylan Cozens, what he's done, for his country, international, on an international stage at the World Juniors.
Great point.
What he's done in the first couple of seasons in Buffalo as well. There's
World
a reason
Cup,
why Vancouver is very interested and has kind of waved Elias Pettersson there as well in potential trade. I'm just, I'm seeing things out there on the internet. We can't believe everything, but I had to throw it out there.
The internet for you.
That's the internet for you. But I think Dylan Cozens, a guy who is rostered right now at around 25% on Yahoo, somewhere around the same as well on ESPN. I think there's a lot of value to be had. I personally don't think he will be traded. I think Buffalo sees what he has to do, and they believe in him. But the fact that he's on the board, he's been talked about the last couple of months. If he were to be traded, tons of value with Dylan Cozens.
Totally agree. I also agree with you about him being moved, mostly because of how fair I think that $7.1 million deal is.
Yeah.
Even though right now, if you compared his numbers over the last season and a half, you'd say maybe that's an overpay. Considering what we think he'll do in return to form, I feel that's a very, very team-friendly deal. He's just got far too much basic hockey sense and work ethic and skill. That's the perfect combination to usually have a ton of success. Fantasy frustrating through the roof. All of these players fit the mold to a T. You could really have a fantasy boom situation if you're that GM who knows what's going on with all of the players that we mentioned, and you know when they get traded, who to pounce on, because someone here is going to be moved, most likely a few of them. And if you were on the ball tapping into the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast, you just got those gems that will ride you into the sunset and that cash, baby. So tomorrow we'll try to do the same bets, breaking it down, what's going on with Sid and any fantasy fallout from the Four Nations face-off.
Four Nations face-off. It's underway. We're loving every second of it. Of course, in Montreal, and it has been an absolute joy to watch these four nations go up against each other. Best on best hockey. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Pod your first listen every single day. Once again, make sure you're staying tuned in for Saturday's special where we break down everything you need to know, same game parlays. For your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. From both Flip and I, we wish you good luck with your bets tonight, and we shall see you back here again tomorrow.